first thing I wish to touch upon is why everything that could possibly be wrong with Medinat Yisrael is wrong. I know that doesn't sound like a very optimistic beginning to a talk, for which I might be willing to apologize, were it not for the fact that what I'm saying I believe is true, and it's better to be aware of the truth and understand the origin and the source and the real reasons for what we see going on about us, rather than live in some virtual reality. Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon writes in his book Mivhar Ha'emunot Va'de'oth, he makes the famous statement that En umathenu uma ela b'thorotheha. Our nation is only defined as our nation, as the Jewish nation, as the Jewish people, as we are, to the extent that we are connected to and living according to the Torah. En umathenu uma, our nation cannot be defined as the Jewish nation, ela b'thorotheha, only by that connection to the Torah. In other words, there cannot be any other definition of the Jewish people, of the Jewish nation, nor can there be any other definition of giur, of conversion, for example. A ger tzedek has to take upon themselves, and this is an essential condition of giur, a ger tzedek has to take upon themselves and to say so and to mean it, to accept upon themselves the obligation of living according to the Torah and keeping all the mitzvot. If it is apparent, if it is obvious, if it becomes obvious that at the time of the giur the person may have said this or that but did not mean what they said, and they were just going along mouthing what had to be mouthed, going along with what had to be, they had to nod and whatever, because that's what they understood they had to do in order to achieve whatever they were trying to achieve, whether it's a Tudat Zahut, an Israeli ID card, or a passport, or a Ma'anak Aliyah, or some cash, or whatever it is. If it becomes apparent that they did not intend, they never meant to accept the Torah and all the mitzvot, then the giur never took place. This is basic, simple, and fundamental. There are certain people who, for various reasons, some of them are called rabbis, who wish to claim otherwise. But there is no basis for these claims. And we need to be aware of that. And all the people who claim otherwise, whether they're called rabbis, supposedly some of the Orthodox rabbis, or whether it is some great leader of the Jewish people like Yair Golan, Shem Rasha'im Yirkav, the head of the so-called Democratic Party, or whatever they call it, HaDemokratim, which is a rather amusing name for such a group of people. Whatever they other views and ideas they may not share, the one thing they do all share, they have in common, is that they conceive of being attached to, being part of the Jewish people, not having to do with the Torah and the mitzvot, but all manner of other things, all other kinds of parameters. We often hear such people say things like, why can this person not be considered Jewish? He served in the army, right? Shirat Batzava. Just like, just like, Ali Abu Tarabin or something, some Bedouin soldier who also serves in the army, may be actually a very good soldier, and may be actually very serious about fighting for this country. But that doesn't make him Jewish. How could they arrive at such a conclusion? Because Tzionut, Zionism, from its inception, was based on based on that assumption that you could somehow identify as Jewish and yet have no connection and no obligation, not a connection to the Torah, obligation vis-a-vis the Torah. It doesn't apply to you, but you can be Jewish just by basically saying that I'm Jewish, or I wish to join your group. It's like, joining the the Scouts or the golf club. There are certain membership requirements. I'm willing to sign this. I'm willing to pay a yearly membership, and that's it. I'm in, right? Why was this so? Why was Zionism, from its inception, based on such ideas? Because the people who basically kicked off this ball called Zionism onto the field, they started the game called Zionism, they themselves were all, to a very large extent, assimilated Jews. Theodor Herzl, who was born in Budapest, the story that people like to tell about him, he never stepped into a shul before the first Zionist Congress or something, is not true. His parents were members of the Neolog, as it's called, synagogue in Budapest, a building that I've seen. Neolog in Hungarian Jewry terms is basically what we would call, or what was called in America, conservative. It's not exactly a reform, but it's also definitely not orthodox. Neolog basically means newly defined Judaism, and that's where his parents were somehow. I don't know how often they attended. I don't have that information, but that's where his parents were members. How often he went there, I also don't know. But he had some clue about some vague idea. But he was definitely a very assimilated Jew, as were many other Jews in many countries, in Hungary, in Germany. The more east you went, in Europe at least, the less this was the case. In other words, people like David Ben-Gurion, they at least attended some kind of Jewish school, maybe even a cheder when they were very small. There were certain things that they imbibed with their mother's milk that they could not eradicate from themselves. There are other Jews who never imbibed it to begin with, and therefore they didn't have to erase it because it was never there. Herzl's right-hand man was a German Jew, or a Jew from Germany, called, known, that's not his original name, but he's known as Max Nordau, who was married to a non-Jewish woman. And he was very, very far along the road of being totally assimilated, and for some strange set of reasons and psychologies that one cannot really fathom, he was very taken with Herzl's idea about a state for the Jews, and it's important to note. The book that Herzl wrote was not called The Jewish State, the Jüdische Staat. It was called the Judenstaat, the Medinat HaYehudim, the state of the Jews. When you look at it that way, it's in some ways miraculous that in Megillat HaAtzmaut, that was authored by a number of people leading up to the declaration of the state in Tavshin Heth in 1948, Leminyanam. It's somewhat miraculous that this country is defined as a Medina Yehudit, because that's not what Herzl wrote. Herzl wrote Medinat Yehudim, Medinat HaYehudim. And to that extent you can even perhaps justify the assimilationists, the Erev Rav of today, who do not wish this country to be a Medina Yehudit, to be a Jewish state. Because neither did Herzl really, and neither did any of those people. And as Shabtai ben Dov in his seminal work, Gulat Yisrael b'Mashber Medina, as he writes a couple of times, this new invention called Zionism and the state that was supposedly the goal of this movement provided a new option for assimilated Jews. You could remain very assimilated, and in other words, not connected to the Torah or to Hashem at all. On the other hand, either the non-Jews amongst whom you lived would not allow you to assimilate and allow you to and pretend to forget that you were Jewish, which is what many Jews discovered in many countries, which they found rather bothersome. But more than that, and sometimes was because the Jew himself, although he was very assimilated and really had no interest in Judaism, but he wasn't really comfortable with marrying out. Not necessarily. Is that what he wanted? And Zionism provided a new option. The new option was, as Shabtai ben Dov writes, lehitbolel letoch hatzionut, to assimilate into Zionism. In other words, Zionism is a new avenue of hitbolalut, essentially, in many ways. It's for all these reasons that when people sometimes ask me if I'm Zionist, my response is no, I'm not. Because anyone who understands what the Zionist movement was all about from its inception, I think, and who considers himself to be a Torah Jew, cannot really, it seems to me, answer in the affirmative. It's true that within that big tent organization, the big tent of Zionism, you had all kinds of people with different positions and ideas about various things. But about this, these things that we mentioned, they were generally agreed. That you didn't have to be a religious Jew, you didn't have to accept the Torah in order to be part of this movement. And this movement is not about Judaism. It's about Jewish nationalism without Judaism, which is exactly the opposite of what Rabbeinu Sa'adia Gaon said, that you can't have Jewish nationalism without Judaism. You can't have Leumiyut Yehudit without Yehadut, without Torah. There's no such thing. Or if you claim that there is such a thing, then you are you are speaking in riddles, as it were. You're stating something which is an oxymoron. It's true that in Torah Samech Gimel, if I'm not mistaken, 1903, Leminyanom, a movement called the Mizrahi movement came onto the scene, which chose to join the Histadrut HaTzionit, the overall Zionist movement, as a separate faction, and they defined themselves as religious Zionists. But it also follows, therefore, that you right there? Just turn it a bit this way. A bit more. Fine. Okay. Fine. It follows that there is an a built-in contradiction in the philosophy called religious Zionism, or Tzionut Datit, because Tzionut is by definition not connected to in any way to Judaism. This is explicit, by the way, officially. This was decided in official votes that took place at some of the early Zionist conventions. The famous statement was, one of the resolutions was, L'tzionut en davar ima yahadut, or ima dat, I'm sorry. L'tzionut en davar ima dat. Zionism has nothing to do with religion. Explicit formulation that was voted on and voted into law, as it were, by a vast majority of the people present. So you have a built-in contradiction and conflict in the very DNA of religious Zionism. That's an important point to recognize and understand. It does not follow that I'm suggesting that I or somebody else should define themselves as Haredi. That's not what I'm saying, because it's a different question, it's a different term, it's a different idea altogether. But that term is most definitely problematic, very problematic. And what's more problematic still is that most religious Zionists are unaware of how problematic it is. When a person lives in a reality, or creates for themselves a self-image and an ideology which intellectually is not sound, is unsound and inconsistent, and full of discrepancies and contradictions. This creates in the person who believes that he is living according to that philosophy, or is a standard bearer of this ideology, that creates within that person a kind of spiritual, ideological fog. A person cannot see clearly. And this, in my view, is the story of religious Zionism from that day, Tafresh Samech Gimel, 1903, down to the present time, which is therefore 101 or 2 years. This is not new, what I'm saying. It shouldn't really be new in anyone's eyes. And despite claims to the opposite, Rav Kook was extremely and fully aware of everything I just said now, obviously. And we know this because he writes this explicitly in more than one place, in his letters, in his collected igrot that he wrote, thousands of letters, and he makes this statement explicitly, that he criticizes the Mizrahi, the religious Zionist faction of the Zionist movement. He was in touch with them, and they respected him, and they even asked him questions sometimes. But he very clearly and unequivocally criticized them for being wishy-washy, basically. Not, but as I just explained, by definition, if you're going to be religious Zionist, you're going to be wishy-washy. You're not going to be clear. You cannot be sharp and well-defined and have true clarity of either in one's mind or in one's heart. It's not possible. So Rav Kook was aware of this, and therefore Rav Kook never joined the Mizrahi in no shape or form. And he stated this explicitly. He even went as far as to try to establish an alternative, which he referred to as Degel Yerushalayim, which never got off the ground. But that's another discussion. But he understood the need for such a thing. The right people to make such a thing happen, to become a reality, were apparently not found at that time. And in fact, I would say that such a movement, it doesn't matter if that's the name that is chosen for it or not, but such a movement that Rav Kook had in mind is something that still has not been able to form and to come into existence in any meaningful way. It was to address such questions that Shabtai Ben Dov wrote this and his other books. So if you understand these basic, simple truths, then you should also understand that it is impossible that Medinat Yisrael should have turned out any differently from the way it has turned out. And in fact, it's even worse than that. I know I'm not being very optimistic, but again, you just have to you have to understand the realities before we can begin to discuss optimism. It's even worse than that, because this country, the Zionist movement, and later this state, Medinat Yisrael, were established by and brought into existence by, and for the first couple of generations were led by what a certain Israeli sociologist, whose name I do not recall, referred to as Ahasulim. Ahasulim is Aleph, Het, Samech, Waw, Lamed. Yud Mem is just for the plural. So what's Ahasulim? Ashkenazim, Hilonim, Socialistim, Lumim, Vatikim as opposed to Olim Chadashim, which is almost the same as saying Ashkenazim and not Sfaradim, and Lamed, Lumim. In other words, those people, there were even amongst those earlier generations, like Ben Gurion and his cronies, there were very distinct differences between them. On some very major points. But at least some of them, like Ben Gurion, were definitely Ashkenazi from Poland, very definitely Hiloni, very definitely socialist, very definitely a Vatik. He was not an Oleh Hadash. Well, he was at one point, but he came here very early. And he was also Leumi. He was a nationalist. He was a very serious nationalist. There were some who were less nationalist than he was, to be honest, but he managed to carry the day on many issues. For example, shall we say, the encouraging or driving out, however you wish to put it, or certainly not holding back, not preventing Arabs who decided to flee at the time of that war in Tawshin Heth, not to in any way deter them from leaving, and in fact to encourage them, and in some cases very actively encourage them. Which, of course, if you are a liberal and a humanist, you will find reprehensible, and if you're a Jew, you will consider to be a tremendous achievement. And that's one of the simple litmus tests that you can apply to almost any person. Does he or she consider that to be a reprehensible act or a praiseworthy act? It was because he was Leumi, Ben Gurion, that he was for bringing all the Jews from Middle East countries to Israel. There were many people in Mapai at that time who were very much opposed to this. They didn't want them here. They said they're not the right people, they're not what we want, and they'll just mess up the country. This is not a theory, this is all written down. The records, the documents, the letters, they're all there. They're in the archives, they've been discovered by historians. If you want to know more about these, there are many books and articles on the subject, some of them written by a historian called Ehud Manor, and there are many others. But Ben Gurion, being a nationalist and wanting to get as many Jews here as possible, as quickly as possible, and he did see a national ideological value in concentrating as many Jews in the country as possible. He was for bringing all those Jews from Iraq and Mizraim and Syria and Lebanon and wherever it may have been, and Morocco, North Africa, Tunisia, to Israel. And he was roundly condemned for this by many of his fellow travelers, because he was an Ahasul. He was Ashkenazi, Hiloni, Socialisti, Vatik, and he was Leumi. Now, as my friend Professor Elisha Haas has pointed out, a generation, historically speaking, culturally speaking, is approximately 40 years. And this country is, before long, will be 80 years old, B'ezrat Hashem. Which means that we are now, and the changeover already, the change of the guard has already actually taken place. If you sit down and you can do the math and figure it out, but it's also not exactly 40 years, it could be 35 years, whatever, but roughly. So the founding fathers, so to speak, of Israel, people like Ben Gurion and people like Ber Katzenelson, and also people like Jabotinsky. They were most definitely all nationalists. There was a nationalist aspect to their Zionism. There was an essential part of their makeup, of their belief system. And that's why it was obvious to someone like Ben Gurion, and actually less obvious to someone like Jabotinsky, it should be pointed out, because Jabotinsky was a liberal and Ben Gurion was not. Because Jabotinsky came from Odessa, he was which was a very sort of, highfalutin intellectual city, and he believed in democracy and liberalism. As Shabtai Ben Dov writes in this book here, no one in the history of the state of Israel has believed in the concept of democracy more than Menachem Begin, a student of Jabotinsky, which is true, unfortunately. They truly believed in it. Ben Gurion didn't believe in democracy. He knew that there was no other option, or it seemed to him at least. You had to at least claim that you were democratic, and you had to put in place a kind of system that could be described, at least tongue-in-cheek, as democratic. It was a kind of default option. In other words, what else were you going to do? All of a sudden, you hadn't really planned for setting up a state. I'll expand on that in one moment. You hadn't really planned what you're going to do if and when you get to actually establishing a state. But now, all of a sudden, the British have decided they're moving, they've had enough. And that's entirely because of the Etzel and the Lehi. And we know that because the commander of the British forces here in Palestine, so-called at that time, says so in writing, that that's the reason we're leaving. So it's not much, there's no point arguing that point. So they decided they're picking up and leaving. So all of a sudden you have to set up a state. So what are you going to do? What else are you going to suggest? A monarchy, a republic? It sort of happened without anyone thinking about it, without anyone planning it, that this became a so-called democracy. Anyone who knows Ben Gurion will tell you that he was no Democrat. And he ruled with an iron hand, and you could not describe the country honestly as a democracy, as you cannot today. But at least formally that was the case. That was the term, that was the term that had to be used. So that's what was used. As the pasuk says, they threw everything into the fire. And the egel just appeared. It's just there. That's it. You have this Medina. Fine. As opposed, and now, when it comes to someone like Jabotinsky, who actually wrote in some of the songs that he wrote about how the Arabs in this country will have equal rights and all, and he even suggested that he said it should be the case that if there's a prime minister who's Jewish, the deputy prime minister has to be an Arab. It's not what I said. This is what Jabotinsky writes explicitly. He was a true liberal and believed in democracy, because like all liberals who are fools by definition, he believed in something called democracy, which is a total insanity. So he believed in this, and therefore Menachem Begin believed in this. And therefore it's no accident that Menachem Begin is the gentleman who told us, Yesh Shofatim b'Yerushalayim, right? And we all know how that turned out. Because only such a person as that could actually believe such a statement that he himself made. As opposed to Ben Gurion, who was not a Democrat and was not liberal. Because he and his fellow travelers came from Eastern Europe, where you do not have democracies. You didn't have then, you don't really have today. And you didn't have liberalism either. So there was nowhere for him to have learned and picked up such inane ideologies. Whereas Jabotinsky had picked up such things, and you can read it in his letters. I have some of his collected letters of Jabotinsky. He was a true, sincere, liberal Democrat. He was also a very big nationalist, true, but he would have been the first to oppose driving any Arabs out. Would have been the first to oppose it. So I said before, it's worse than you think, because the Ahasulim, who are Ashkenazim, Hilonim, Socialistim, Vatikim, and Leumim, their children and grandchildren are all of the above, except without the Lamed, or actually with the Lamed. Instead of being Leumi, they're Liberalim, the liberals. Liberalism is an irrational, unhinged notion based on an even vaguer notion called humanism, which means very little. Even they themselves can't tell you what it means. Basically means whatever they want it to mean. But one of the basic tenets of this ideology is that you must not and cannot ever relate to anything to do with nationalism. Nationalism is, by definition, primitive and criminal. And that tells you all you need to know about the party today called the Demokratim, or everything you need to know about the so-called High Court, etc. The Lamed remains, but instead of being Leumi, it became liberalim, became liberal humanists, and any vestiges of true Jewish instinct, feeling, any authentic Jewish reflex that existed in the generation of the founding fathers. Essentially, we're talking almost 100 years ago or 80 years ago. Has in the meantime dissipated and been lost completely. This also has a lot to do with the Yekim, with the Jews from Germany, who, when they began to arrive in this country in the 20s and later in the 30s, they had very little impact on the country initially, because they were very assimilated by and large, but they were on a different cultural level, and they couldn't rub shoulders with these, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish socialist Zionists. These people were riffraff in their eyes, which many of them were, and they were, Herr Doktor and Herr Professor, and they were cultured, and many of them were highly educated, what have you. By no accident, all these people, or the top echelon of all these Yekim, ended up founding the Hebrew University. People like Magnus, people like Martin Buber, people like Sholem, people like Yeshayahu Lebovich. Beginning to get the picture? Initially, they had very little impact on the country, but they did establish that first university, and they were the ones who began to educate the younger generation of students in their own image, and to create them in their own image. And that's how we ended up with monsters like Aaron Barak and Yitzhak Amit Shem Roshem Yerkav. In other words, whether they're Yekim genetically or by extraction is not the point. They imbibed that ideology, which was a very, very, very assimilated, liberal, humanist type of ideology, which had almost nothing to do with Judaism. There is, in fact, a whole book on this subject, speaking about these Yekim, these Jews from Germany who came here, and their eventual impact in the longer term on the country. There's an entire book on the subject called "The Pity of It All," written in English by an Israeli writer, actually, Amos Harel, I think his name is, if I'm not mistaken. It was eventually translated, I think, into Hebrew, but it was originally written in English. So, anything we see today, such as this disastrous so-called hostage deal, which is not a hostage deal, but a surrender, basically, should not surprise anyone, because a liberal humanist cannot but do such a thing, because they see there's a human being over there who's suffering, and that's it. That's the end of the discussion. There's nothing else you can say or do. You have to go ahead with such a deal. And now, seeing that Netanyahu is exactly such a person, he is a liberal humanist, despite whatever claims he or others may make to the opposite effect. That's who he is essentially. If that's who Menachem Begin was, why should you imagine that he is not? If Jabotinsky was such a person, why would you imagine that he is not such a person? Of course he's such a person. Then it was obvious from the outset that just as the same Netanyahu 14 years ago made that criminal and disastrous Gilad Shalit deal, the same Netanyahu will do the same thing again, to me, unfortunately, this was obvious, and I took it for granted from the first day of the war. And therefore I entertained no real hope that it would be otherwise. So what are we to do? What can we do? We have to disseminate these ideas and these facts and explain to people that assimilated liberal humanists cannot possibly defeat our enemies. It's impossible to win a war against their enemies led by such people. If someone tells me, wait a second, didn't we get rid of Nasrallah? We did. And did we not deal some serious blows to Iran? We did. And what about what happened in Syria? All that's very true. I would tell you, first of all, that as the American expression goes, it ain't over until it's over, right? We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think we've seen the end of it. Second of all, I would tell you that Netanyahu and others who maybe were involved in some of these decisions could not possibly have known what would transpire as a result of this or that strike. In other words, they could not possibly have known what would happen in Syria. It just fell into their laps. And we don't even know whether in the long term it's a good thing. Yet we don't know. It all depends on many other factors which are as yet unclear. But yes, it did bring down the Assad regime, and that was not something that Netanyahu or anyone else could have planned or predicted. It was also could not possibly have understood how great a psychological blow to Hezbollah taking out Nasrallah would be, which apparently it was by all reports that I've seen. It was impossible to know that in advance, but apparently that's the case, which is good. But Netanyahu doesn't deserve too much credit for a number of these events. On the other hand, he deserves anything but credit for some other decisions that he most definitely took knowingly, with being fully aware of the inevitable results, such as this deal, as happened the last time as well. So someone like Netanyahu is not to be. We shouldn't imagine that he can be, and he should not be held up as some kind of a savior or a genius. It's not true. It's not true. Hashem, despite everything, was on our side. Now we can be a little bit more optimistic, and despite everything that we do wrong, certain things turn out for the better. But it's not because we did things the way they should have been done. In fact, we did almost everything precisely the opposite, the reverse of how things should have been done. And there's no clear sign that this will change in the near future either. It's entirely true, I know, that the Biden administration placed us under embargo and pressured us in all kinds of ways. That's entirely true. But a different kind of leader would have responded differently to those pressures, just as a different kind of leader would have said to Trump about this hostage deal now, can't do it. It's not going to happen. And a guy like Trump, much more than a senile Rasha like Biden, is someone who respects a strong leader. A guy who can say no. And but Netanyahu didn't say no. And it's worse than that, because even without Trump, he would have gone for this deal, as we see 13, 14 years ago. It's the same person, and the conditions are even worse now, much worse. So we have to understand that nothing that we see going on around us should be seen as surprising, and nothing should take us unawares. It is only by stating loudly and clearly that we are Jews dedicated to Hashem and the Torah. And that means that we think in Torah terms, and not in Leumi terms, and not in liberal terms, and not in socialist terms, and none of those ideologies. As Rav Yochanan Wasserman Zitzel wrote, that any ism, by definition, is not Torah. For a person who says he's a Zionist, or he's a socialist, or he's a capitalist, or he's a whatever it is, any term, any ideology, well, by definition, that's not Torah. It's another ideology. It's another type of philosophy, but it's not Torah. If you believe in Torah, then you're a Torah Jew. That's it. You cannot and must not describe yourself as being anything else. That has to be something that we understand and that we internalize and make mention of to all our friends and acquaintances all the time.
Does the rabbi think that had the German Jews not come to Israel, that the country would have taken a very different trajectory?
We all know that in history you can't really ask that question. What if such and such had not happened, or what if such and such had happened? Who can say? Who knows? But we do know what happened, and we can see the results, and those are the true results. I mean, it's not as if there's something unreasonable about what I just said. Who was it who stood outside the jail in which Adolf Eichmann, Shem Roshem Yirkav, was held the night before he was hanged? Who stood outside the jail with a placard saying "Lo Tirtzach"? Who was it? Martin Buber. Is that surprising? Shouldn't surprise you. One of those liberal, humanist, intellectual German Jews. One of the leading lights of that circle, right? It shouldn't surprise you that the rector of Hebrew University at the time of the foundation of the state and the years leading up to that, whose name was Magnes, was opposed to Zionism. He was explicitly anti-Zionist, and he supported the idea of a binational state, an Arab-Jewish state, officially. And he criticized the Zionist leadership for not accepting such an idea. And he had many other fellow travelers, and they were all, mostly anyway, Jews from Germany. Those are the facts. And therefore it shouldn't surprise us that the courts and the judiciary and the legal establishment of this country spend all their time discussing the caloric intake of the Nukhbot in jail, and sending in young 18-year-old Jewish girls to, when they ask for a blanket because they're cold, she's sent into that cell to give them a blanket so that she can be harassed and attacked sexually, as was reported on the news yesterday. Today, nothing new again. None of this should surprise you, because when a person is so completely off the rails, then anything's possible.